I'm Kathy Dugan. I'm the director of the Cleveland Law Library. My partner, Helena, will introduce herself and our speaker and author in a moment, but I want to wish you all a happy National Library Week. We are recording this today, so just to let you know.
Hi, everyone. I'm Helena Trafka from Cleveland Public Library Social Sciences Department. And today I would love to introduce to you Wendy Koile. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. Wendy has been a lifelong resident of the state of Ohio, and she's enjoyed exploring all of Ohio as well. She is an English teacher at Central Ohio Technical College and holds a master's degree in teaching as well as one in English. Wendy is the author of 4 books from History Press, including the one we're reading today called Lake Erie Murder and Mayhem. She's appeared on the Ohio Channel and several local radio stations to discuss her books. When she's not writing or teaching, Wendy enjoys traveling with her family, looking for beach glass, or reading a good book. She is currently working on her first YA, a young adult book. And I will give it over to Wendy.
Let's start it off, Wendy. Did you want to give a brief presentation, or do you want to start off with questions? How do you want to handle it?
Sure. So I received the list of questions, and I'm comfortable with that. And I can just start off by telling a little bit about my background and how the book came to be. So as Helena mentioned, when I'm not writing, and I call it sometimes my real life, I teach English courses, and I'm also the director of teaching and learning at Central Ohio Technical College. But throughout my childhood, I always liked to write. And then when I got in college, I really started to like history. So it just kind of seemed like it was a good fit to maybe try my hand at writing. So in 2012, then I published my first book with the History Press, which was Geneva on the Lake. And I chose that book because we'd always vacationed up there. So since the time I was a child, and it always seemed like Christmas and the best part of my year. So I chose to write about that book. So then what happened is my publisher, I don't know, got this idea that I'm this Lake Erie guru person. And so they were like, that's pretty far. Why do you always write about things on Lake Erie? I'm like, well, the publisher, you know, they'll just come to me with some ideas and we'll play with ideas. But also I don't fight that, because I find the history along the lakes very exciting. So when I'm standing out looking over the lakes, I'm like, there's got to be so many stories and mysteries here. So that's why I continue to write about Lake Erie. So the 4th novel, the one that we're talking about today, when I started to think about writing again, over the course of writing those first 3 books, I had gathered like stories, anything about Ohio that I found interesting, and especially about Lake Erie. And I started to pull those out, and I'm like, man, I got a lot of crime stories. So I went to the publisher, my publisher, and went back and forth, and we came up with the idea of writing in they have a series of books. So one of their series is Murder and Mayhem. And he said, I think that'd be a really good fit into that series. So that's how that book came along for me. And then, so it came out in September of 2021. And like I said, I'm starting to really get some presentations and that all lined up. And what's exciting too about writing books that are on the lake shore, sometimes I'll get these calls or these emails from really cool locations, like somebody on Kelly's Island will call up and say, hey, can you come out and sign books on the island in July? I'm like, let me think about that. So yeah, so like a lot of the places that I go to book signings are really fun, especially in the summer and the early fall. But yeah, that's sort of how that book came along, and I'm excited about having a new one out and getting back into doing presentations.
So it was different than writing this the last couple of years while we were, sequestered during the pandemic.
Yeah, so what had happened with my work, I went remote like so many other people have. So for the writing part, that really opened up some time for me because I commute. So 2 hours a day, plus the energy involved in the commute and sitting in an office. So with the writing piece, that made it easier. But where it got difficult is because my book is so heavily researched, a lot of the libraries and museums were closed down. So that got tricky over the pandemic. But I have a lot of connections from earlier books. So they were more, I don't know if they were more willing to work with me, but it helped that I knew people and what I knew how to ask for certain information and images and that. So yeah, so the writing piece was easier, but the research was a little more difficult during the pandemic.
Do you get permission to get all those photos and everything that you put in your book?
Yeah, so that's a definite that we have to acquire permission, or the publisher won't accept those. And that's another thing. Since my first book that I wrote in 2012 till this one, that's gotten trickier. And I think it's because more books like mine that are written through the History Press or Arcadia, where they're like image heavy, they're getting more and more requests. So things are getting a little more difficult. And then they're also charging a lot more. So that my first book, I don't think I paid for any images or to use any images, but this last one, almost all of them, had a fee with that. So I just think because we're working the librarians that go and find the pictures, scan them, but there's the fee. But yeah, and then the publisher has like the rules laid out about how you go about getting that permission and what's accepted and what isn't.
Now, I noticed some of yours, it said it was from your collection. So then you didn't really have to worry about all of that, or did you still have to get some kind of permission?
Yeah, so I think some of those rules are changing a little bit because my best writing friend, Jane Terzilla, she also, writes with the History Press. And prior to this, whatever's happening with some of the rules, if you had like postcards that you had got off eBay, it was considered your collection. But now there's some kind of issue with the copyright on the postcards. But a lot of those old postcards, the company that originally put that out, they're long gone. So I think by the next time I write, we're going to have to find some way to figure out what those rules are and how that applies, because in the first few books that was no problem. If you own those pictures, they were in your collection, that was fine. But now I feel like it's starting to change and get trickier with that. And she was working with the Cleveland Public Library on some of those, and there was some copyright hangups and how things are going to be done from here on out. So I think it's all changing, but I won't know until I really get into the next book and what I need to do. But I think for this book, it's fine with my personal collection.
Ask about how research intensive, it is for you to write a book, and how much time you spend researching before you put pen to paper.
Yeah, so in my mind, I kind of have the process divided into 3 parts. So there's the writing, and then the research first, and then the writing, and then the gathering of the images and getting those permissions. So I always think of that in 3s. And then this particular book that we're talking about took about a year, and that's with me working full time and a family. So I don't know if I wasn't working full time, if it would be less, but so if you break it down by the year and the three parts, so each part was maybe 4 months time, and I'd write a few hours a day during the week, maybe a little bit on the weekend, but about a year to get through that whole process.
Have you ever done any like personal interviews with your books?
Yes. So if I can find anybody that's still connected with the family, one rule that I have is I ask them to just read the chapter because I want to respect the family and make sure that it's done right. So the second book I did on the treasures, here's an example. I talked to, I think it was the nephew of, I don't know if you're familiar with the Giants of Seville. Well, they were 8. The man was 7.5, and the woman
Oh, I
was,
think I remember.
yeah. Well, I found a nephew, or no, it was a niece of the man, and I'd ask her questions, and then I said, would you like to read the chapter to make sure you're okay? She said, okay. Well, when I opened the chapter, I'd made where the giant was walking through the door frame, and he said, damn. And she asked if I could change that to dang. She didn't want him to cuss. Like, okay, that's no big deal to me at all. So that was an example. And then with this book, the first chapter, there was a woman that traveled on a steamship. Her name was Noreen Mosey. And I found would be the granddaughter of her. And we struck up a correspondence through email, and she didn't know a lot. She knew that what had happened and that her dad talked about it a little bit, but he was kind of closed off, and he had died the year prior to me writing the book. But we struck up a nice friendship and kind of talked back and forth. And again, she read the chapter for me and approved that, it was respectful of the woman's family and that. So anytime that I can find people that have some connection, that makes me feel better too, because I don't want to put it out there and then somebody come forward and be like, hey, that's my great grandfather, and you didn't get this right, and you didn't tell the story right, and our family's unhappy. I would hate for that to happen. So if I can find people, and I became kind of a genealogy expert because I have to get into people's family trees and figure out if they still have living relatives. And they always say, well, how did you find me? I'll be like, well, I was in your family tree and narrowed you down this way. But yeah, definitely if I can find somebody with a connection, I reach out to them first.
So, the people who are listening, feel free to jump in with questions, but Helena and I will keep it going, of course. I'd like to know, did you write your stories in the book in any particular order? And why did you save the one about Mary Appleby for last?
So when I write, they're not in the order that they are in the book. I just write whichever one, I don't know, I feel led to write about, or I don't know how I choose that. I just pick one and go. But when I organized the ones in this book, I noticed there was different types of crime. So there was murder, there was a bank robbery, there was a con artist. So I kind of like tried to lay them out where there's a variety. So I didn't want like the first 3 chapters to be all these stories like a murder that happened. So there's kind of, they're kind of mixed. And then in the middle is the one on the hoaxes. So the guy with the snakes, which was kind of light because he was trying to trick the whole town. I'm like, well, that would be good to kind of give a relief there in the middle. And then the one with Mary, I did want to end kind of on a good note because that was such a great story. And like I had talked about all these horrible things that happened. And I'd saved that story about Mary for so long, probably since my writing of the first book. I'm like, I've got to get this story out. And it's not necessarily a murder mayhem story like the other ones are, but I talked about how sometimes our biggest crime is not listening to our instincts, in which case Mary didn't listen, that she was having all these bad dreams and bad feelings, but she still got on the ship. But yeah, so I was happy that I could include that, and I wanted her at the end so it would end on a positive note.
It did, and I caught that, and I thought that was probably your intention, but I wanted to see if you did that on purpose.
Do you find some of these stories? Is it just from visiting, or?
Yeah, so generally I start, like I said, I've collected, but also like I would go into like newspapers.com or one of those, and I would just put in Lake Erie murder, Lake Erie crime, and start a search that way. And then also sometimes like if I'm at like a book signing and that somebody will come up to the table and they'll be like, hey, do you have the story on such and such that happened out on the lake? And I'll be like, no. And then I'm like writing it down really fast and can't wait to get home and look it all up. So, and I just kind of keep that to the side for a possible next book or an article. And then also I have a huge collection of like Lake Erie books. So sometimes I'll look and see what other people did. And I always try to take my own slant on it as well. But I really like to put stories in that nobody has covered before. So like the Mary Appleby, I can't find much on her where somebody wrote. And like that first story about the murder of Noreen, nobody's ever did an article on her that I could find. So the more obscure, the better for me.
Have you held any for your next book, or are there, some you didn't include for, save it?
Yeah, so my next book, I'm really leaning towards a young adult book, which I can talk about in a little bit, but I still have some Lake Erie stories, and I sometimes play with the idea of like women on the lake that had caused some issues. So I'm not sure if people are aware that they think that women were some of the best rum runners of the time, because what would happen is they'd come back across from Canada and policemen weren't allowed to frisk women. It was not permitted. So they'd say there's probably countless women rum runners. So I think like a story like that. And I found all kinds of women that didn't behave along the lake shore. So that's a potential idea for another History Press book.
That sounds interesting. So tell us about your new your venture with your YA book.
So my dream book has always been to write something for like middle school or young teens, because when I grew up, I was always a reader. And so I felt like that got me through a lot of the stress of being a teenager. And, it was just a stress relief. And so now I love to connect with kids and help encourage students to read. Plus, I know what happens when they get to the college level and they're not strong readers. So my dream is to create a book that would just reach out to a young person and they'd pick it up and they'd love reading. So this book that I'm working on, and it's probably going to be about 10 chapters. I have 4 chapters done. It is America's Creepiest Schools. So it's stories on like abandoned schools across the country that have some spooky story attached. I just feel like with middle school kids, they would eat something like that up. And so like if that one would take off, then I'd like to do a series. So maybe the next one would be America's Creepiest Amusement Parks and go from there. But yeah, I just like a lot of times when I'm at a book signing and kids come up to the table, they're my favorite people to talk to, and especially if they're interested in reading and writing. So I'd like to have a book when they come to my table and say, hey, check this out, and sign it and make that connection to hopefully encourage reading for young people.
Kids used to read I think it was a mystery series, I think, of school books or something.
Oh, yeah. There's the Magic School Bus.
That's
Yep,
it.
my daughter did those as well.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. So are you a fan of true crime, or is that just one interest that you have?
Yeah, I love to read. So with the true crime genre, I really like local stories. So like I'm a fan of James Renner, of course, James Rosilla. And I don't know why that is that I'll read local crime, but when it comes to like the national true crime, I don't know, I get so uncomfortable and they're pretty gory. I don't know why that is for me. I stay away from them. I'll watch true crime TV, But my favorite genre, just to relax, is probably suspense and mystery. So I read a lot of K.L. Slater, Alex Lake. That's probably my favorite genre just to read for fun.
So how about our attendees? Do you have any questions, or do you want to share with us if you enjoyed the book, or if you've been to any of the places that our author mentioned? Quiet today. Well, you know, I didn't know that there was a Confederate prison around the lake. And I didn't know they had dumped weapons in the lake. Have they ever recovered those weapons? I mean, that seems like ridiculous today to do that.
Mm-hmm. You know, I couldn't find anything more on that. I just found the article that they were offshore dumping them. And I feel like that was pretty normal, maybe, because it didn't make national news. It was just a little blurb in a Buffalo newspaper there. So I'm assuming they were trying to scatter them so people wouldn't find them. I mean, I think that'd be pretty cool to dive, but they were secretive about where they were dumping them. So I'm betting they're still there.
Because nowadays they burn them, don't they? You know, melt them down.
Yeah, or lock them up for evidence and that. But yeah, I was surprised when I found that they just out there dumping like 1,200 weapons into the lake. So
crazy. So do you have any theories about the Atlantic and why it's got sensors surrounding it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, they kind of went back and forth about who was at fault. So I sometimes wondered while I was writing, I'm like, do they not want people to get down there and get a close look at where the boats crashed? But I really think it's about, people taking items from the ship and just trying to preserve it. There's laws now too, like anything recovered within a certain distance of the ship, I forget how many feet it is, that would belong to, in this case, Canada. But I think mainly they just don't want people to go down there and take items. But it's one of the only ships I've ever read about that is like heavily guarded with these expensive lasers.
Make me wonder, it's like, what are they hiding on the ship and stuff that they don't want us to know about?
Yeah, there's talks of like, there was a safe on there and somebody got it, but I'm like, I wonder if there's more to that maybe, like you're saying, maybe there is more in the ship that they know about that hasn't been recovered.
So like some chemical or plutonium or I don't know, it's something crazy like that could be dangerous even, I guess.
Oh, that's true too.
So as a lawyer, I have to ask the question. I don't know. I think there's at least one other lawyer listening. You lace your book with these wonderful references to whether it's legislation or cases or whatever that were responsive to some of the things that happened in the book. And how did you connect the dots, or did you have a legal advisor?
No. So it was mainly all my research. And one of the tricky parts with writing a book like this is I want to tell the story, but I also know that there are people probably like you that are like, what happened during court? And my sister works in the court system, and she's like, yeah, put it all in there. I'm like, well, I'm not going to put it all in because not everybody wants all the technicalities in that. So I had to be careful, like how much was enough, how much was too much. But yeah, so when I would come to a story and I knew they were investigating, if the FBI is involved, the first place I go is onto the FBI's Freedom of Information page. And you can now, and I didn't have this for the other books, but you can now request information for some of these cases. So the story of Noreen, the FBI was called in, and the story with the pirate Joseph Kerwin, the FBI investigated. So I felt like that's the best that I can get. So when I requested that first story for Noreen, they sent me over 200 pages of the investigation, what they did. And, you know, Edgar had signed off on them. And so I felt like, well, I'm going to use this as my main source. And then with the other ones, there was a story, one with the con artist. A judge had wrote a book about his most memorable cases. So I used that as a source for that story. And anything I can get that's the closest to what really happened and the closest to the official investigation or the official court case, that's what I would use. And then sometimes there's things I didn't understand what they were even talking about. And that's when I'd have to do a quick Google search. And like the story where I talked about how the guys were laying in wait and how that's a different kind of crime if you're like, it's premeditated. So yeah, I educated myself on some of those items and the rules changed. So like a lot of my stories were at the beginning of the 1900s. Well, they may be different now. So I had to make sure I knew, is that still how it goes or is it different? Yeah, that took us some sorting out because I'd never done just like a crime heavy book. So.
Tell us about the other books you've written. You mentioned one of them at least. Tell us about the other ones you wrote.
Sure. So my first one I said was on Geneva on the Lake, which is considered Ohio's first summer resort. And that one, you know, kind of walks us through the history of like how that became a resort, because there's all kinds of towns along the lake shore, but it talks about the early families and how that idea took off, that, you know, it actually started as a picnic area and people from like Pittsburgh and that would come along and camp there. So that's how that tells the story of how that all came to be all the way up until the writing of the book till 2012. And then the second book, I'm sorry, I'm at my mom's. She still has a phone. It's ringing.
I'm surprised we haven't heard dogs or, you know, anybody's.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the norm nowadays, you know.
I know. I think it's actually not normal to hear an actual phone ring. So I don't know why she still has that. She has a cell phone. But anyway, then the second book is Legends of Lost Treasures, Northern Ohio. And that one came about because when I was a little girl, I always would dig up my parents' backyard and look for treasures. So then when I found my daughter and nephew doing the same thing in my front yard, I started to think, well, I wonder if there ever were treasures in Ohio or stories of treasures. And so when I started to research that, I found out every county, all 88 counties, have their own treasure stories, at least one. So Ohioans do appreciate a good story. And, you know, some of them were true. They did find things that pointed to real treasures, and there's some that still maybe are lost out there. But that was a fun book because that one I really just had to like look at the legend and how it came about. I didn't have to prove the treasure was there because I'm not going to go up and dig out the land, but I like to look at where that legend came from and why do they even think there's a treasure there and how might have it been placed there. And then the third book was Disasters on the Lake Erie Island. So that one revolves around things that happened out on the islands. And, you know, I just had a book, an author fair this weekend, and somebody said, well, what kind of disasters happened on the islands? And I said, well, you know, the thing of it is when you're on an island, it's different than when you're inland. When you're on an island, a fire, you're out there by yourself. And back in the day, they didn't have the fire trucks and that. So they'd be stuck with this fire out there. And in the winter, hardly anybody would be out there. Or if you were stuck in a lighthouse by yourself or just with your family, a disaster is different on an island than on land. So, but yeah, that has, like, you know, islands that we're all familiar with, like Kelly's Island, Put-in-Bay, Middle Bass. But it also talks about some lesser known islands. There's one called Turtle Island that Michigan and Ohio used to fight over all the time. It's a teeny little dot on the map. And there's West Sister that nobody lives on. So yeah, that one gives some island history and then talks about some events that happened out there that would constitute a disaster on the islands. So those are my first three. And then of course the fourth one.
Now I have to ask about the treasures one. Now you didn't go back there and dig anything up, but have you heard about others going back and going, I wonder if there's really treasure there, and start digging up stuff and then
That's a good question. Well, I haven't heard of them physically going out there, but sometimes I'll get an email and they'll be like, how did you do the research for this treasure? Can you share that with me? And I'm thinking, well, why do you want to know so bad? But I usually will share. I'll be like, wow, here's an article. Here's an article. I went to this library. I went to this historical society. Like, it's not a secret, but I do think are you so interested in that particular one? Yeah, and
because I was picturing somebody getting up in the morning and having their lawn dug up because they read about a treasure in a book.
Yeah. And they'll come looking for me since I put it out there. So good.
And they'll be like, well, it wasn't a fiction book. She said it was true.
Yeah, she said it's there. So
Have you ever thought? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
I was just going to follow up on that thought. Have you ever thought of writing a book that's pure fiction, suspense or a mystery, or, make up a treasure? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I play with that idea as well. I think because of the type of writing I've done, I'm just so comfortable with that, because now I can say, well, I'm not making this stuff up. This really happened. But the fact that I've always read and I enjoy fiction, I play with that idea. And, I never thought about the idea of writing a story about a treasure. That would be a really good fit. And then I also play with the idea of historical fiction. I'm like, oh, it's kind of a hybrid. I could still have my research piece, but then I could add in my own story. So that's the idea I've thought about. Well, see, I've got lots of good ideas.
You quoted somebody in the book. Was it Mark Twain? Make sure you know the facts and then you can make up stuff. Was that who it was?
Yeah.
I can't remember. Was it Edgar Allan Poe or Mark Twain? I can't remember.
I think it was Mark Twain, and I did quote Poe in there somewhere. And then I think one of my favorite quotes is by Agatha Christie. She said that almost every murderer, or all murderers, were somebody's friend at one point. And I like that. I'm like, that gave me something to think about. But yeah, they were somebody's family, somebody's friend, and then it all went haywire somewhere.
May I quote from your book, chapter 6?
Sure.
It says, get your facts first, and then you can distort them as much as you please. Mark Twain. That was in your book.
Yeah, that was the one right before the con artist that tricked both countries. He ran back and forth and they weren't sure if it was him. And so I thought that was fitting for that chapter.
Without a doubt.
Now, who were your favorite authors, like growing up and maybe even now?
So growing up, I really liked R.L. Stine. He wrote like the spooky, I think he was one of the first that
did
that teen genre, and yeah, that's spooky. Before that, it was like the Ramona books.
Oh yeah.
Ramona Quimby.
Oh yeah.
Charlotte's Web is an all-time favorite. But yeah, in my teen years, it was R.L. Stine. And then what is interesting to me, I just probably in the last 5 years actually switched into the adult section of the library. Like, I've always read YA books. So like I'd be like a grown woman down there in the YA section digging around. And then I'm like, I've got to maybe read books been written for people my age at some point. And so then I discovered this whole new world, and I don't know why it happened that way. So it's only been a recent transition that I come out of the YA books, and now I'm more into books written for people my own age.
Well, sometimes when you're raising kids and stuff, you read the things that they have to read for school and this and that. So maybe that.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I think when I read too, I don't like a lot of guts and gore, or, you know, I don't really like a rated R book. So I just thought maybe all adult books were like that. Well, then I find these authors and these great mysteries, and they don't even swear in them. I'm like, okay. Some self-discovery.
Well, you know, I don't know how many kids' books I read too. My son was a big fan of Dave Pilkey, anything written by Dave.
Mhm.
And of course, Diary of a Wimpy Kid.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there were just so many good series, you know, and then Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. But I mean, I've got bins of books at home, you know, that my children read as they were growing up. So I totally understand.
Yeah, there's just something magical.
Well, and two, it's until your kids grow up, sometimes you don't find the time to do something for yourself.
That's true.
I don't know. That's been your experience. It was mine.
Yeah, and, you know, when my daughter was growing up, she's in college now, but I'd take her to the children's section, while the YA section's right there too. So it was just easy to be like, let's go over on this side and grab some books. So I suppose that had a lot to do with it as well. But now she can be turned loose in the library and I can go in the section.
I'm sure you have a lot of librarian friends that will give you suggestions. And if not, you can always contact me. I can.
Oh, that's awesome. I have a librarian friend from our library, our local library. Well, she drives by my house on her way home or to work. So over the pandemic, she got to just put in some books in my mailbox for me, because she would just check them out. And then I'd text her and be like, they're ready to be checked back in. So it was a nice system. I kind of miss it, but I didn't want to take advantage of her.
Oh, you have your personalized librarian. That's pretty amazing.
Great. Yeah, I loved it.
It's a good thing nobody used your mailbox as a little free library and just helped themselves.
I never thought about that. Well, I'd hurry up and get them too before the mail carrier, because I'm not sure if you're allowed to put things like that, you know, use it for other purposes. So I'd hurry up and grab them out of there, or have her pick them up in the evening when the mail had already run.
Now, I think it's great that you're doing all of the historical stories, especially for Ohio, because it's a lot of history gets lost.
Mhm.
But did you ever think of doing like anything autobiographical with local famous or semi-famous people, or maybe someone that isn't famous but has just a really great story to tell?
Yeah, you know, I have, and like a lot of times, so I'm getting ready to present at this nonfiction conference. And what I do with that conference is I'll take a story of, actually the story I have that I have them practice with is the story of the person that invented lifesavers. And I forget his name now, but anyhow, then I have them look at how would you go about researching this and writing about this guy. Well, the more I dig and the more these people in the conference start looking, they'll have their phones out. I'm like, man, there's a really good story right there on somebody that isn't a well-known Ohioan, and who would think that would be so interesting. Okay, he invented the lifesaver, but he also had like lost his son, and he was kind of cheated out of the business. So there's always that kind of idea in my head. And, you know, if not a book, even an article for a magazine or a newspaper that would fit.
I Googled it for you. Was that Clarence Crane?
That's it. Yeah. See,
I was typing while you were talking.
That's
the beauty of having this online. I can multitask, right?
That's awesome. Yeah. I could not remember that name. And
that's a good idea, is to do a series of articles, because then it wouldn't be as time intensive.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a lot of historical figures here, and some of them were pretty famous from our library. And we did an anniversary booklet when our library turned 150, but we only wrote, you know, like a half a paragraph about everybody. But a more intensive discussion or an article would be good. And you have the expertise to do it.
Yeah, and like I said at the beginning, the more obscure, the better, because I just have this attachment. Maybe it goes with the treasures too, like for things that are lost or could be lost, I want to preserve those. So, you think about some famous Ohioans like the Wright brothers, there's so much out there on them. But like Clarence and the Lifesaver, there's not much about that. And I would like to try to preserve that in some way. So that always pulls me along to more obscure history that could be lost if somebody doesn't capture it.
And I actually thought about that as I was reading your book. Your introduction, of course, talks about, the war on the lake and the Perry Monument and all that. But it was in the introduction and not a separate chapter devoted to it. And I thought, you're right, there's so much written about that already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you don't want somebody thinking you're copying theirs. And I know there's rules about how that all goes about with plagiarism and that, but to me, I don't know, it's just more interesting, I think, to the research process. So if I was going to look up, so actually I was researching a woman that was, she had a business in Marietta, and she was putting out that she was a mail order bride, and she was scamming these men, and they would send money and she just wouldn't appear. And so then they were chasing her down. And I just loved that. I'd never heard the story. There's so many questions that need to be answered. Whereas something like the Perry's Monument, I can probably go and easily Google and find that. But this lady, it would be, what can I find? And it's like a treasure hunt, finding information on her and preserving her story, because it was quite the story. So that's another article idea, by the way.
Well, wasn't Marietta the first capital of Ohio or something?
Yep. So
That
I
would be interesting.
Yeah, I presented on Marietta, and one of the things when I present, like to do a talk, I try to include a story that involves the town I'm in, because people love that. It's kind of a surprise. It's not in the book maybe, but I'll just hurry up and find something. And that's how I found the story on her, because I was going to present in Marietta. I'm like, there's so much history here, and there's so much that has been done. I'm like, I want to be just tricky to find a story that isn't covered in Marietta history books. Well, she wasn't. So that's the story they got, and they loved it.
A lot of oral history that, hasn't been written down or memorialized,
Right, because I know sometimes I think about, like, unfortunately, my parents have passed already, but of course, now that they've passed, I've got like a million questions for them.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're younger, you're just like doing so many things. But I keep thinking, it's like, I would have loved to have heard more of their story and what they've been through. And I keep thinking of all these people, even now, that immigrate to the United States,
Mm-hmm.
or now all the people in Ukraine that are leaving and coming back and all that. And I'm thinking, we hear about all the famous people, but it's like knowing the story of even your neighbor that
Right.
may have, traveled all over until they made it to becoming your next door neighbor.
Yep, that's exactly right. And I think we connect a lot with the everyday, ordinary person. And so when you can capture their story, you can see part of yourself in that. Well, I can see why they did that. And I understand why, this led to this bad decision or good decision, whatever one it was. And I think that, like the girl next door, this lady that was running the mail order bride scheme, they were probably all in shock when she did get caught.
I don't want you to disclose any financial, remuneration, but I just have to ask, is this a true joy or pleasure for you to do, or is there money to be made by writing these kind of books?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things I talk about when people say they want to write, you can go into it for different reasons, maybe the fame and the fortune, or like myself, I love the story and I love to get it out there. And I feel like I have a good way of organizing. And so when I'm writing, I'm like, oh, I got to get the picture that goes with this because the readers would want to see this. All this, I just feel like I want to get the story out there. And then, you know, I do make some money, but I could never quit my full-time job at this point and do that. And it's when I go to like a big author fair, I can a lot of times figure out who is writing for what reason, because if it's slow, I feel like the people that are there to make money aren't that happy. But the people like me that I like to meet other authors and that whole experience and share about our ideas, then the day isn't so bad for me. It's like, well, okay, I'm not making money, but I'm talking to this person that knows this publisher, and they also have this idea, and we build on each other's idea. Yeah, so I guess it just depends on how you go in and how you think about that part of it. One of the surprising pieces with this is that other maybe wannabe writers or people that are writing their own book have hired me to help. And I never thought about that being a source of revenue. So like I edited a big project over the fall. And so there's other ways that you can make some money, or you can teach like writing workshops, you can create courses online, so that those possibilities are endless. But because I am full-time at my real job, I don't go all out on that. But I could probably work it to be quite lucrative. I'm content with the way it is now. So if I make some money at a show, that's great. But I really like to talk about the book and the process and all the stories involved.
So it's an avocation. Go ahead, Helena.
I was going to say, it's like that and being around others and stuff, that creative energy. Plus, you get all these people that just are readers. Because I know, like, if I go somewhere and stuff, I'm terrible. I am such a book pusher. And it's like, oh, you should read this and you should read that. And I'm thinking it's like, it must be sort of the same way. It's like you get ideas, and it's just that kind of a high that you get off of it.
Yep, it is. And only other people that have sat like all winter writing a book understand that whole process. And like, I think a lot of people think, you know, you tell them, okay, I'm going to write a book, and then the next thing they know, they see this book and it just like happened, and that it must be so much fun. That person must be, but a lot of days it's hard to make yourself write. You know, like I remember I think it was a second book I wrote while I was on vacation because I had a deadline. And so I think other authors understand that it's not all, you know, there's some trials and tribulations, and even in the research, we'll talk about that, how difficult that is. So that's nice because you kind of have your own support group built in there. And it's a whole network that I never thought about when I first started writing, that I'd have all these cool author friends.
And have anybody ever asked you to collaborate, or is it a solitary profession for you? You want to write your own material?
So Jane Terzilla and I, she writes for the History Press. We go back and forth on that idea. So that's a possibility. I just don't know how all that would work when you do your taxes and actually make a little bit of money. I don't know how that would work. And then a publisher just recently, he's from the University of Toledo, reached out and asked, do you have any ideas? We'd be glad to work with you. So there's that angle too, that sometimes a publisher, and I think a few years ago, maybe Kent State had talked to me about some ideas as well. So there's always that too, like working with another publisher. I feel like I get comfortable, so I know all the expectations now, so it's hard to switch.
What were you going to ask, Helena?
You know what? I forgot.
Oh, okay.
But it's, yeah, I was going to say, it's like you get into your comfort zone, and sometimes it's, but I don't know. It's, I really enjoyed your book, and I'm kind of looking forward to reading the other ones. And it was funny, a friend of mine that just started teaching up at, Higher Institute over by Geneva. I had told him, I go, this one is set over by Geneva and stuff. And he's like, oh, I might have to take a look at this and make my students read it, because he's
Ooh.
trying to have a connection for them because they're all living there now. That would make it interesting for them a little bit to know the community and everything. But
Oh, yeah.
yeah, but I don't know. With me, it's like I used to go to Book Expo, and then because of pandemic and stuff, the
Mhm.
past few years, we couldn't go. And personally, I've missed it. It's like they do it online, and that's fine and everything. But sometimes you don't really discover anything until you go somewhere. It's like the book fairs and even the art fairs and stuff. Sometimes local ones would have some of the local authors there and everything. So, I don't know, do you miss some of that stuff to, you know, well, do you miss it? And have you gone to any of like the book fairs like that? Well, it used to be Book Expo, but they're renaming it something else, but even local book
Mhm.
fairs and stuff?
Yeah, so, it's always a big thing for Ohio authors to get into the Buckeye Book Fair at Worcester that happens in November. And then Ohioana happens in April, and that's always a big honor to get accepted into that. So I've attended both of those for the first 3 books. And Ohioana is coming up, I think, the last Saturday in April, and it's all Zoom, and I'm going to participate in that. But I do miss, like, for Ohio, when I think about how that was before the pandemic, there's such an energy in the room and seeing all the shoppers and then the authors engaging. I do miss that piece of it. But some of them are starting to build back up. So like I just did Stark County Library last weekend, and I know like Twinsburg is having one. So they're slowly starting to appear. I know that Buckeye was actually face-to-face in November. So I'm hoping that this November it will be as well. I'm going to try to get into that. But because those ones, a lot of times, that's where they're coming to buy books. Like at that Buckeye Book Fair, it's in November. It's right before Christmas. And they'll come in with like the great big grocery shopping bags. And I don't even have to like do anything. They'll just come up and they'll have like my picture circled. Yep, I need to get this one. Can you sign it? And then it's on to the next table, and it goes on all day.
Well, that leads me to ask, do you use some kind of an agent or a marketer to help get your book out there and the word out that you've published something else, or who does that for you?
Yeah, so we have a publicist through the History Press, and they really like push it like the first, like maybe a month before it's released. And then I think it might be a couple months after it's released, like there's a huge push. And then after that, and that's again, another thing I never thought about as an author, that I'd have to like do some of that kind of marketing. Now they'll help. So like, let's say I want to get in contact with you all, they would help me, and they would help me set up an event, or they might send me like a banner if I asked. But after those first couple months, maybe it might be 3 months, I don't know. You're kind of on your own, other than if you ask for their help. So, there's so many creative ideas too of how to get, I use email a lot and kind of send out a flyer about, hey, this is my new book. It just came out. I'm available for workshops and presentations. Of course, I have Facebook with, I think Helena, that's how she found.
Yeah, that's
realized.
That's how we've kept up with each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was funny. It's like, that's how I used to, when I was running the book club for social sciences, that's how I would find local authors that fit into my subjects, so that I could have a live person whenever possible, because people just enjoy that more. It's like picking the brain and going, well, how did you write this and why? And it's authors become celebrities.
Right. Especially just for the day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, we love having the author for our talks. We've done 2 or 3 over the past 5 or 6 years without the author, and they just weren't as fun.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
having the
I can
author in person or on Zoom is just marvelous. All those insights into the book process and the book itself, it's just wonderful.
Yeah, and like you kind of get the idea of how the author's brain worked during that process and why they included this and why they chose a certain topic. And I like that as well. I go to a lot of my local libraries, like book talk, especially if an author's coming in, because one, I like to support other authors, but two, it's interesting. Like, I feel like you get the behind the scenes tour of a book this way.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good way to put it. Probably a great way to wrap this up as well. I'd just like to open it up to anybody else. A final question or two, anything? There were a couple comments. We're hoping to be able to have books by the banks down here someday, and that's from a colleague of mine down Southern Ohio. And it's so fun to have the author here. Thank you, someone said. So same colleague. So so anything else for the good of the order today? Well, I would just love to thank you, Wendy. It has been a joy to have you here today. And I want to thank Helena for getting you to our event.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was fun to just sit back and kind of have a discussion about the book. And it's interesting to see what questions people have too. I'm like, oh, I didn't think that people would wonder that. So it's interesting to me. But yeah, thank you. It's been a lot of fun today.
Well, it was great seeing you again, and just keep writing, because this book was great, and I can't wait to read more.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you have to let me know what you think.
Oh,
Good or
okay.
bad.
Well, now it'll have me more curious about when I go to places, because I think that
Oh, yeah.
makes things more interesting. Like if you read some of these books and there's a local connection, you're just kind of
Mhm.
more invested in it.
Right. Little trivia that only you know because you read the books.
Exactly.
Well, good luck in your next venture and any other ideas that you have for writing, and enjoy the summer and touring with your new book.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.